Hello, you are listening to Secret Art of Spacetime, a podcast about ideas, culture, and politics from an esoteric lens. My name is Andy, and I'll be your host. Hello. I want to speak today in a different way, in a different mode, in a more intuitive way, about what we've been talking about, what we've been weaving our way towards. I'm not going to be concerned today with evidence, with argument, with reason. And I do think all those are important, and I will get to those. So while in the past few episodes I haven't been speaking directly about gender, that is one of the central themes that I'm wanting to explore. And I actually think there's something about gender that it's somehow not appropriate to speak about it too directly. And I don't mean that in the sense of like, I want to skirt around the issues because it's, controversial or anything like that. Like, that's not the point. I actually think gender is so important to who we are and our experience in bodies and on planet Earth, in a metaphysical sense, even in a spiritual sense, and is so embedded in everything that it's hard to see, and that when we speak about it directly, we miss it often. But at the same time, I don't think avoiding it is a solution. A lot of people talk about how they don't like using the words feminine and masculine. And I think the reason is that the words are tied to a lot of stuff, right? A lot of baggage. And, in general, gender carries so much pain. But that's not a reason to avoid it or to avoid using the words. And in fact, I think that makes it even more important to talk about it. Let me state a few things about where I stand, so to speak. The first thing that needs to be said is gender is not sex. Gender is not biological sex. They are not one and the same thing. There is a relationship. There's some relationship between our bodies, our biology, and gender, but they are not one and the same thing. We all are both masculine and feminine in different ways, to different degrees, in different combinations, in different flows, in different dynamics. Gender is not biology. It's related to biology, but not in a perfect, simple way. The second thing I want to say here is I also don't see gender as only social, and yet it is importantly social, socially constructed, historically mediated, cultural, deeply so, importantly so. There's no simple divide between nature and nurture. It's a false binary. Right? The fields of epigenetics, of neuroplasticity even, the fact that culture itself can be seen as biological evolution, as adaptive, the complex interaction between culture and biology, these all reveal that there is no simple divide. We can never sift through and determine exactly like what percentage of any one trait or behavior is nature or nurture. And so with gender, it is both. And I would say even more, even more than nature or nurture, I think there's also something spiritual, even perhaps metaphysical, about gender. So I think it actually even goes beyond both biology and culture. So it is extremely, extremely complex. So we see people wanting to take each of those positions, biology, culture, and spirituality, and claiming that that is all there is to it, right? That we could understand gender completely from one of those perspectives. And I think those approaches always miss the mark, actually, because, for example, sometimes in the spiritual community, whatever that is, we see people defining gender without any kind of analysis of social influences, right? And gender has been so impacted, so altered, so formed and shaped through cultural forces for literal millennia, and has been a major site of control. And this is the main reason there's so much pain tied to gender for so many people. We all might be able to bring to mind reasons that queer folk or women might feel pain with regards to gender, but there are many reasons that men might feel pain as well. We've all been manipulated through contortions in the meaning of gender and in the forcing through of certain roles. And there are particular shapes that have been forced upon masculinity through patriarchy that have been deeply damaging to men as well as everyone else. So without any analysis, right, without sifting through the ways in which power has corrupted and influenced our understanding of gender, then we are bound to recapitulate the definitions, the modalities, the embodiments of gender that lead to pain. And with that insight, right, with the seeing clearly through the degree to which gender has been manipulated socially, that has led a lot of people to understand gender as entirely socially constructed. And that's not an illogical conclusion. But because I'm approaching this also from a spiritual perspective, and in many spiritual traditions, gender is understood metaphysically, and that rings true to me in a deep way. And I've experienced that in very visceral, embodied ways in like spiritual contexts, that I think that while gender is deeply impacted by culture and history and power, that's not all there is to it. I sense that there is something important and essential at its root underneath all these layers of corruption, we could say. I also think that attempting to subsume gender entirely into biology is not only reductive, but it's moralistic. It's a way of trying to police people and enforce how people should be. But that isn't to say that there is no relationship to biology. Of course, our biology impacts us socially, psychologically, but it's not like a determinate, simple relationship. So, on the one hand, I don't want to deny our biology, our embodiment, our lived experience of a particular body. And yet, can you feel how that inclination to sort of enforce or impose how one thinks others should be is, just like a form of policing, a form of control? That is perhaps our current cultural instantiation of this historical control over gender. This attempt to enforce rigid definitions, rigid roles. It's a contemporary manifestation of patriarchy. Okay, so perhaps these things needed to be stated right off the bat. And yet, this is not the shape of thought, of conversation that I'm wanting to approach this from, because I want us to have the space to think freely and creatively, to explore new lines of thought that may even open new ways of being. I think one of the reasons it can be tricky to speak about gender is that it ultimately can't be defined. Like, if we attempt to approach it in a literal way, in a logical way, if we attempt to provide a precise definition, I suspect it almost always or very often misses the mark. I think that perhaps approaching it through metaphor and through myth may allow us to get closer to the truth. One reason for this is that gender finally isn't binary. Perhaps it's closer to being fractal. Like, rather than two different shapes, right, for the genders, maybe the symbol of the yin and yang is much closer to the truth. There's always one within the other. You can't fully separate the masculine and the feminine. And perhaps for the masculine to be masculine, it actually needs to have some of the feminine within it. And if you explore that feminine within it, perhaps it has masculine within it, and so on all the way down, fractally, to infinity. There's no hard line separating the genders. In a metaphysical way, they are swirling and dancing and interacting and creating all that is. So we're beginning from the end here, but it isn't a straight line after all. So maybe that's exactly the right place to begin. So if we loosen our hold on the need for definition and literalness, if we allow ourselves to think more metaphorically, then what if McGilchrist's notion or description of the left and right hemispheres could provide very useful metaphors for gender? And he wants to avoid gender. He states that the hemispheres aren't gendered. Although, isn't it interesting that the title of his book does gender the hemispheres after all, in a metaphorical way? But he himself emphasizes the importance of metaphor and myth. And while I have deep respect for his work, I absolutely adored that book, The Master and His Emissary. Yet I think his overarching metaphor of the master and the emissary is exactly the wrong metaphor. But let's set that aside. I don't want this to be a critique of that book. I want to explore in a generative, creative way gender. And let's just play with this for a moment. If you were going to playfully, in a metaphorical way, assign genders to the right and left hemisphere, given what we spoke about last time, which gender would you assign to which hemisphere? Which gender is more linear, logical, literal, analytic, precise, historically in the West dominant? And which gender would you associate with the hemisphere that is less literal, more metaphorical, more poetic, more aware of context and embodiment and the practical aspects of life and relationship and wholeness? So without needing to force it to fit in some literal way, I actually think the hemispheres can be useful in elaborating, perhaps, in describing or in exploring how we see gender. Let's take just one very simple idea from McGilchrist. This idea of the masculine being linear and the feminine being circular. McGilchrist, of course, doesn't relate the circle and the line to gender. He's relating them to the hemispheres. So he says, quote, "The tendency to keep on progressing inflexibly, always in the one direction, may have to do with a subtle feature of the shape of the world as seen by the left hemisphere compared with that experienced by the right hemisphere. It has often been said that the left hemisphere is the hemisphere of linear processing. Its cognitive style is sequential, hence its propensity to linear analysis or to mechanical construction, taking the bits apart or putting them together one by one. This is in keeping with its phenomenological world being one of getting, of utility, of always having an end in view. It is the reaching of the right hand towards its object, or the flying of the arrow from the bow. Its progress is unidirectional, ever onward and outwards through a rectilinear Newtonian space towards its goal." And then later, he says, quote, "By contrast, the shape that is suggested by the processing of the right hemisphere is that of the circle, and its movement is characteristically in the round, the phrase we use to describe something that is seen as a whole and in depth. Circular motion accommodates, as rectilinearity does not, the coming together of opposites. Cognition in the right hemisphere is not a process of something coming into being through adding piece to piece in a sequence, but of something that is out of focus coming into focus as a whole. The movement of the right hemisphere is not the unidirectional instrumental gesture of grasp, but the musical, whole-bodied, socially generative movement of dance, which is never in a straight line towards something, but always ultimately returns to its origins." So as I was reading McGilchrist, I was considering how perhaps the hemispheres could be used as a metaphor or a way in to thinking about gender. And I thought this idea of the circle and the line was sort of perfect and also kind of hilarious because it's such a almost like childlike schema for understanding sex in a pretty funny way, I think. It's like the stick figure version of sex. And I was also thinking about how when the circle and the line are added, they create a spiral, and how the shape of the spiral holds such like esoteric significance and relates to evolution and to time. So I was already thinking these things, and I had written the notes for this episode, but I hadn't yet recorded. And then I happened to listen to a podcast with someone speaking about Kabbalah, and he spoke about the circle and the line as gendered. And I was just like, whoa, we're on to something here. Especially if we understand metaphor as not just a playful aspect of thought, but actually fundamental to how thought works, to language, to reality itself. What if gender is a metaphor of sex? And there's this book I love that maybe I'll go deeper into in another episode, but I just want to sort of invoke the idea developed in this book here. The book is Philosophy in the Flesh by Lakoff and Johnson, a cognitive psychologist and a linguist. And they argue that language is inherently metaphorical and that most metaphors develop from our embodiment, that we really can't separate the mind from the body. In a deep, deep, deep way, we can't separate them. And that most language evolves out of bodily metaphors. And when we can't see the metaphor clearly, many times it's just that we've forgotten the metaphor, or that, the metaphor is sort of in the ancient past, right? In the etymology of the word or the thought form. But that many concepts, even concepts that seem very abstract, actually derive from bodily metaphor. So what if gender is like a deep elaboration of the metaphor of sex that becomes psychological, meaning just because it's related to sex doesn't mean we don't all engage in both ways of being. Or here's the mystical version. What if sex is a metaphor of gender? The line drives forward. It has a goal. It has a direction. It has a purpose. It divides. It penetrates. The circle holds. It encompasses. It enfolds. It unifies. It unites. It draws together. It connects. It's cyclic. It's not so much about direction and goals. It's more about being present. Intuitively, I'm calling that being, but in the philosophical tradition, that would be becoming. The presence of becoming, being present with the ever-changing worlds, the world that presences itself. In terms of consciousness, the linear way of being is future-oriented. It reaches towards something. It's moving forwards, moving beyond, progressing or striving, aiming to progress. It wants to accomplish and achieve. In terms of consciousness, the circle is simply present. It's here, it's now. It moves with the cycle of the moon. It moves with the cycle of the seasons. It moves with the many embedded, complex cycles that layer and interact and create the movement of time, but that we experience right here, right now, as this unique moment in time, in place that will never be repeated, that is always different, always becoming, always moving, always in flux. When these two modes collaborate and dance together, we can experience spiral time. The planets orbit around the sun, not in exact circles, usually in ellipses. So these, of course, are abstractions, right? The line, the circle are abstractions in a linear analytical sense of something that we cannot understand in an only abstract way. And you can see that even in the orbit of a planet, which never takes the shape of an exact circle, because in embodiment, in nature, there's complexity, right? So there's other planets, other gravitational forces pulling on each planet orbiting the sun. It's never as simple as one sun, one planet in an abstract way. A planet orbits the sun, but the sun itself also moves, not in a perfect line, but in a linear way. It too is moving through space. So the entire solar system moves through space. So the planets actually aren't forming even inexact circles. They're forming spirals, inexact spirals. And as our experience of time is deeply impacted by the movement of the planets, and particularly, obviously, our own, right? A day is defined by the rotation of our planet on its axis. A year is defined by the orbit of our planet around the sun. And as the orbit of our planet around the sun is less circular and more spiral-like, so is time. We do come back around. We do experience the seasons cyclically. We do experience similar situations again and again. We do come back around to the same lessons. But if we are moving not just circularly, cyclically, but also linearly, then when we come back around, it will not be exactly the same. No summer is exactly the same as the summer before. Even when we come back to learn a similar lesson, we have changed in the meantime. And so, in terms of consciousness, if we are aware, right, to the extent that we are aware, then we can move in a spiral. We can learn something. We can evolve. Maybe we could say growth is a line, being is a circle, and evolution is a spiral. I'm not sure. I just made that up. But there is something deeply true, I think, about the spiral. And I think this is a reason, too, that as we evolve in consciousness as a collective, we are starting to remember in a deep, deep way. Many of us are experiencing resonances from ancient history, from what is sometimes called other timelines. But see, we get confused when we see time in a purely linear way. Timelines, ancient history. But these stories, these remembrances, which may not be crisp and literal, right? It may be more embodied and vague, mystical, right? But they are with us here in the present. The past and the future are in the present. They are constructions of the present. They inform the present. They create even the present, or the present creates them, or both. So as we evolve in consciousness, we become more aware of the rhyming of our current moment collectively with certain cycles from our ancient past, our ancient future. We see that we have an opportunity to evolve through the spiral of time, to not merely repeat, right? These resonances are entering the fields so that we can learn as a collective, so that we need not simply repeat our history. The space that makes the difference between a circle and a spiral is the space in which consciousness can enter, in which we have choice, in which we can choose differently, in which we can choose the spiral rather than the circle, to experience a lifted version of the archetype, of the resonance, as it is on an individual level when you encounter again a similar situation with greater awareness and you have the capacity to choose differently, which is not to escape the circle, right? Or to experience something completely different, right? It's the same situation, but it's different. It's transmuted. That's maybe the key word. Transmutation is what takes us from the circle to the spiral. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for being here with me. Please do let me know how this lands. I love to hear from you. So until next time, goodbye. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. For more information, for more content, go to Substack. The link is in the show notes. Until next time, take care.